Welcome. The discussion for today's first panel discussion is Journey from FLN to Future Readiness, and are we ready as an ecosystem? We have an interesting mix of the panel members here. Professor Vimla Ramchandran, Director, Education Research Institute, gives us the perspective from an academia perspective on how potentially this topic is playing out, and with her vast experiences, how she sees it going forward. We also have Mr. Sridhar Rajgopalan from Educational Initiatives, founder of that. I think from a practitioner view perspective, how is it happening on the ground and what are your learnings out of work, data, research, how is that shaping up? We do expect Mr. Shekhar Singh to join us in the next 10 to 15 minutes, getting the administrative view that how it's being prioritized against multiple competing priorities will be the third perspective we hope to get through this discussion. So I'm going to start by throwing this session open with broad views from each of the panelists on how they are viewing the topic, what is their reflection on the same, and take the next maybe 3 to 5 minutes sharing their perspective on that. Professor Vimla, I'm going to request you to take the lead on that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't come last year. I was supposed to be here. I've been sort of working in the field of education for over 35, 40 years. I've now retired, really, from active research and training. But there were 3 opening statements I wanted to really share with you. One is this concept of foundational learning is a dynamic concept. It's not fixed. You can't say that if a child learns 3rd grade mathematics and a child has learned to move from paragraph to story, the foundational learning is done. I think what is foundational changes as the child goes up in the academic ladder. For instance, for a child in class 8, the requirements of foundational mathematics is going to be very different than for a child in class 4. Similarly with language, it's not about just reading a paragraph or a story, it's about ability to comprehend what you're reading, to be able to get the gist out of it, to be able to critically think about what you're reading. So one of the points which I really would like to emphasize is that this static concept of foundational learning, which is propagated by some organizations in the country, that you teach them basic maths and teach them basic learning and you're done, is actually a very unworkable concept. The second important point, opening remark that I'd like to make is that, is our system really ready for it? Here I'd like you to think about that, for instance, many state governments have MOUs with several NGOs. And these NGOs come and provide external resource persons to come for 1 hour a day and teach them foundational. I don't think that is a workable model. Every single teacher at every stage needs to be engaged with foundational learning, so that she knows that my child or my children, these 10 children are at this level, these 3 children are at this level, so she can move on. So this whole concept of having an external person zoom into your school system, teach for 1 hour and leave, I think is an unworkable concept. And I think it's a lazy interpretation concept. The final point I'd like to, of course, I'll expand on this later when the panels are asked the question, is that when a child doesn't keep up with her level of learning required, then the cumulative burden of not learning actually catches up with her. That one of the main reasons why children drop out after class 8 is because they are not able to cope with the syllabus of class 9. Or many children fail in class 10 and just drop out. So I think we need to keep this in mind, that learning is a cumulative process. and not learning is a cumulative burden. I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will just build on what Vimlaji has said. So, when you look at the 7 habits of highly effective people, this is a set of 7 habits that Stephen Covey had popularized. So the first habit is be proactive. But after that, the next 2 habits basically say, begin with the end in mind, and then put first things first. And I really like these 2 habits because that kind of corresponds with what we feel we need to do even in a system like ours, right? So what do we mean by begin with the end in mind? It is that, both have a vision as well as steps to ensure what we want our children to achieve at the end of the system, So we have often said and believed that the rote learning that we see in the lower classes and the way that teachers go through their work is actually stemming from what we are expecting at the end of the system. So if in case I have a board exam that basically says, as long as you mechanically do what is here, that is good enough, that is going to permeate through the system. And we experienced this firsthand many years ago when we started a school in Ahmedabad in 96, 97, and we found that as long as we were only the lower classes and the primary classes, we were doing fine. But the moment we had class 9 and class 10, there was a push-down effect from there, saying, look, this is what children have to do in class 9, and this is what they have to do in class 10, and hence you should teach in this way in class 5. And that this way was a mechanical way because this is what is required. So, and today we are fortunate to be working at both those spectrums. One is a board exam reform, but the other is FLN. And the thing that sometimes people don't realize is that these are connected, that the reason that if, do children need to read, or is it okay if they go through the motions of what you're doing and moving ahead to the next class? And if they have to truly understand and absorb and, learn from the surroundings, they need these foundational skills. As Vimla ma'am said, it's not a mechanical thing, but it's like, what do you need to really absorb and learn from the world around you? The second point that I'll just mention, and I'll stop with that for now. People can say that in today's world, where technology has come in so much, why do children need to learn to read? Okay? Or why do they need to learn to write? Because, a computer can write for you. But they do need to do these things not because you cannot have someone read out to you, or you cannot have a system not only read out to you, probably read out to you in any language that you want, but the very process of reading and writing develops certain connections in the brain, develops certain skills and capacities in you that you are going to use in everything that you do. What we call critical thinking cannot happen the way you would think critically think in quotes critically if you did not learn how to read, is going to be fundamentally different from that basic skill that a child acquires. And this is true, even for skills which are, if you talk about motor skills, for example. So all of these skills are part of a continuum that you build and that develops the child's understanding and thinking as you go along. And that's why the importance of foundational skills, even at the very basic levels, actually does not go down because of technology. And we see this all the time, that if you do not have those basic skills, you're not even able to use the technology that is available to you. So I think the importance of some of these has actually increased. And on what we can do with the technology has increased, but we can do it only if our children are all adept at these basic foundational skills that we need to have. So I'll close with that for now.
Thank you, Sridhar. I think both from Professor Vimla and Sridhar, the call out being that foundational itself is not a one-time bar, right? It's changing and evolving as we are looking at different levels. But if I want to build up on that point and further, so the second element we're calling out is future readiness, right? And just by definition, when you say foundational, it's the base. Now, of course, the base needs to be strong. You need to build up from there. But the second call out is future readiness. We heard from the dean in his opening remarks on how his own experiences with what ChatGPT is doing from his days to what students are facing now and how they need to be ready. In the school system, from a future readiness perspective, how is that journey shaping up? As you set up your school, your experiences, you have been working extensively with a lot of research and data across, and some of the work you're also doing with CBSE. I'm going to ask Sridhar to take the lead and share your perspectives, your experiences, and your takes on that, please.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a very important point for us to reflect on. It's also a very sobering point because a lot of studies are showing that South Asia, South Asia is not the poorest region in the world, but South Asia in many respects is falling behind many other parts of the world in this element of, call it future readiness or the skills that children need to be successful in tomorrow's world. And there have been studies which show that there was a study where they picked up 2 African countries and India and Pakistan, and they looked at what is required from students when they write the school leaving exam. And they found that the extent to which the requirement is mechanical or recall or replicating what is there in the textbook was actually higher in the South Asian countries, even though in terms of per capita income, we were actually better than the African countries that they had picked. So the world in the future is going to require a number of skills. I mean, one of them, for example, you have skills like collaboration, right, where you're collaborating, you're taking feedback and so on. But the ability to think critically, to apply what you have learned in one field to a real life problem, these are kind of skills that if you see, these get developed when we study math in class 6 or language in class 8. We are not doing it for the math and the language that we are doing in those grades. It is to develop this kind of thinking that we can then apply. And as we all know, with COVID, with AI, this kind of a change where the world that you are learning in and the world that you're preparing for are like becoming very, very different. People talk of professions lasting for years, and not even decades, and things change. So what your ability to kind of learn for this and to change the next thing is extremely important. Now, what this means at the school level is that I have to get my children to be thinking at every stage, to be able to understand what they're doing and not answer mechanically. And the opposite of this is actually happening in our exams and what we're expecting from our systems. And it's very interesting to see why this is the case, right? So what has happened over the last few decades and why has this happened? And we find that there's actually a kind of a competitive pressure among boards, right? So today, if you tell a board that you need to have questions that require the children to understand and think, their responses are, 1, if we do that, marks will go down. And there's a pushback from parents and the political class the moment that happens. And hence, we cannot do it. They often say that if others do it, we will also do it. And everybody is kind of getting into that trap. There are assessments like PISA, and I don't want to get into whether PISA is good or bad. We think that it definitely has value in terms of giving a sense of to what extent are children able to apply these skills and where are they in this respect compared to others. One of the other challenges we find in India is that we benchmark only among ourselves, right? So at most we're willing to look at other states. But what are the learnings there? What can we learn from other countries? What are the things that we need to do better? So to me, future readiness is about children having this ability to think, to critically think for themselves, to develop a number of 21st century skills. And this has to come in from the school, right from the earlier stages. But it also is kind of signaled by the school leaving exam that we have. So these are the things that we would have to make changes in to develop our children for this world of the future.
Thank you, Sridhar. Shekhar, welcome. Good morning. We just kicked off the first panel. We're discussing the readiness to move from FLN to future readiness. Wanted to get your opening thoughts on that, and we'll build up from there.
I feel in many ways future readiness should be a common terminology for everyone, but in many ways I feel it still isn't. And I often keep saying that, see, we are sitting in FLAME right now, right? What students learn in FLAME and what they are being prepared for is very different from a XYZ other college, anywhere in Pune or even in India, for example. When you look at the government system per se, and frankly speaking, future readiness as a problem is there even in private schools. I'm not even very sure whether once you compare a private or a public education system, whether really students who are studying in the private schools as well are really, really future ready. As he was very rightly pointing out, there are a number of skills that might be required in 21st century going forward. For example, a very critical skill which I feel a lot of times our students lack in any sort of a system, including government system, is about your emotional quotient or how you deal with people outside. And a lot of times we don't even know how to deal with people, right? It can have n number of connotations to it. It can have a connotation of an empathy with your fellow beings, which could be across, caste, creed, whatever you might want to put those divisions as. Empathy could also manifest itself in terms of empathy for nature, for example, which becomes a very critical future readiness skill I think that all kids should have. I sometimes look at the Japan system and I really like it much more than other places because of very, very basic, simple things. There was this thing viral with regards to FIFA World Cup recently where the Japanese audience were picking up litter after everyone had left. And that included Americans, Europeans, everyone. And those are the kind of small things which I feel in the long run can, really sort of differentiate a society, a culture amongst other people. Now, when you talk about future readiness, I feel climate change and empathy for nature, which frankly, by the way, used to be a very critical part of our own culture as well. Not very long ago, we were, as a society, as a culture, we were very attuned to nature. We were very attuned to, taking care of small things with regards to nature, or what we've begun to call as sustainability now, right? That used to be a very, very normal part of, routine part of our life, which in a way, as our society is moving towards commercialization or materialism, we are forgetting those issues. Then there are issues like, which we all keep hearing, right? AI, ML, it looks like a monster right now. But that's what internet was in 90s and 1980s. I was a small kid, I don't know, maybe others would have a better perspective. But from what we keep reading, that is what it was. So whether our students are currently, equipped, ready to sort of face that challenge where, there is this AI, ML and other things working and still you would need human aptitude, still you would need human intelligence, still you would need the intellect unless we reach a matrix sort of a paradigm where, their entire paradigm only has changed. So I feel these 2, 3, 4 aspects are very important for me. As he was pointing out, I think I would agree with him. You can't really differentiate कि AI का skill होना चाहिए, इसका होना चाहिए, उसका होना चाहिए. There has to be a basic, say, problem-solving skill, for example, which then, you could be faced with any problem. That is how probably we were also brought up, and we have been able to, deploy that in terms of trying to solve the problems in administration or otherwise. And I think those skills become very important. But again, I'm saying a skill for a student who comes from a slum and is studying in my municipal school can at times seem very different, but at times has to be very, very same. But I would still say, in spite of us wanting that those two things should be same, is not many times the same. I don't know whether I made sense in the last part, but...
Well, thank you, Shekhar. Few days back, Madhukar spoke to me and he told me, I would like you to moderate this panel. And I told Madhukar, kya connection hai? I don't come from the education field. So why me? So he said, you're coming from the industry. You are one of the recipients of students in terms of as they move on with life and they take on roles in the employment segment. You are one of the industry recipients and you're working. When I say you, I mean the company is working extensively on skilling programs. We're also working with multiple schools in Pune across the spectrum. So you're saying at least from that perspective, whatever little bit your perspectives are, what you have seen will come into play. So that's the attempt at trying to bring it here. So, but if I build up, Shekhar, on what you shared, what Sridhar shared, and I'll request Vimlaji's view on that. So one is the whole social emotional levels and how we prepare from critical thinking, from problem solving. We heard about resilience, all of those aspects. But increasingly, one is also talking, hearing, investing in harder skills, right? You're talking about vocational education becoming more prevalent. So at one end, there is FLN. We're talking about building the whole social emotional skills, building that skill set. There is investment in building a vocational skill set starting from grade 6 as part of NEP. From a focus, priority, from an ecosystem perspective, multiple engines are firing at the same time. How do you see that playing out, and is there a conundrum on where to prioritize Do you work on all? Do you prioritize one over the other? How do you see that journey progressing?
Rather long question, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. I will start with an example. I'm associated with, like an advisor, with an NGO in Delhi called Itasha, which actually works with children to make them job ready, in the sense. So I was really surprised that when the Delhi government was trying to hire teachers from DIET, this was some time ago, they approached Itasha and told them, can you please make them job ready? Now I was wondering why District Institute of Education Training, which was giving a diploma in education, needed their students to go through a job readiness program of 6 months before they actually became teachers. And that what I discovered was that they may have learned a lot of quote-unquote theory and subjects, but there were many things in which they were completely clueless as to what is happening in the classroom. What are the kind of skills that the person needs to bring when she or he has been going to be appointed into a government school, into a municipal school? This is AAP government, so they were the ones who pushed this thing. And among the things was to have empathy for the children coming from the poorest of the poor communities in Delhi. To be able to talk to children in a way, to be able to have those skills of communication with children, and not just come into the classroom and do just write on the board and ask the children to follow it. So there are many skills that you need over and above the academic part, which makes you job ready. Similarly, the kind of skills that young people needed to get into Maruti or to get into Reliance Retail, because these are the kind of training programs we do. We found that for each and every single silo of employment, the kind of skills that group of youngsters needed was slightly different. And you had to go to the work environment, study the work environment, understand what the challenges are, and come back and make the students ready for it. This is a kind of a 6-month readiness program. Now, why am I giving this example? Because what I do feel is there is, in addition to what Sridhar said about a push-down effect, there is something called a suction pump effect, which I always use. What is the suction pump effect? That there are certain requirements in the job market. There are certain requirements in the academia. There are certain requirements when you go into a professional course, if you want to become a doctor, if you want to. And based on those kind of employment avenues, there are certain requirements downstream. For instance, when you come down to medical education, you find that a lot more emphasis today needs to be given to preventive and public health. But if you look at the syllabus of most medical colleges, this is one area which is very weak. I'm not saying it's absent, but it is very mechanically taught. But post-COVID, we know how important preventive health is and overall public health is. How sanitation and water and air is actually linked to the health of people. So what I'm basically saying is that if you have to be future ready, then you need to do 3 things. The first thing you need to do is you need to be aware of what is happening in the ecosystem that the children pass out into. What are the requirements of that? And to create intermediary institutions that will actually provide this if your colleges and your schools are not able to provide. Because we know that 40% of our engineering students are unemployable. That is what the data says. Almost 40% of the whole country, your engineering students are unemployable. Industry doesn't want them. So who is supposed to provide this in between? The second point is, which I think is extremely important, is that you need to integrate what he was saying about this emotional learning, I don't want to use only the word emotional learning, to be sensitive and aware of your environment and to be able to respond to it accordingly. What happened in Kolkata with that doctor was also because somewhere we did not care about the environment in which these young women were doing 36-hour duties. The medical system was not aware of it. This not only happens in Kolkata, it happens all over the country. That our doctors are doing 36 hours, 48 hours, 72-hour duties. And the final point I'd like to make is that you need to look at foundational learning, I'm going to repeat this point, as a dynamic concept. It is not a one-time thing that, okay, asar mein jo chahiye, hum wo karenge. That is not it is. You need to, because the foundational skills, I'll stop with an example, another example I'll give. We were asked to evaluate the schools run by His Holiness the Dalai Lama's government. And we spent 6 months going to each school and spending a lot of time. And what struck me most was they would have an empathy month. They would have an inclusion month. And the month I was in one of the schools, it was they called it the Karuna month. That is what they call it. Every activity in that school, whether it was songs, whether it was a drama, whether it was painting, whether it was in the dining hall, everything revolved around the concept of Karuna. You know what Karuna is. Actually, it is empathy. And I found those children to be one of the most beautiful school children I met. I spent 6 months from one school to another, spending a lot of time with them, staying there. And they were so loving and kind. I did not find aggression. And the kind of aggression that we are talking about these days in the US and in Indian schools, I didn't find that aggression there. I think we have a lot to learn from those Tibetan schools. Thank you so much.
Ikar, if I were to just build up on this question from your perspective, as you run your PCMC schools, from a resource allocation, from a prioritization, in the spectrum of various initiatives, various focus areas being driven, how do you see them all coming together, or do you take a ladder approach that prioritize something and then move to something else, or it's all coming in together?
See, one of the major issues in the government setups, organizations, it could be state government, it could be union government, it could be a city level government, is how do you institutionalize a particular thing? Now, I, from a very personal perspective, attach a huge currency on the education that a child receives, because probably of my life experience in terms of, I often keep sharing it, my dad came out from a village, he could go to IT Roorkee, he could do stuff in his life, we could get what we could get, because, I saw how education really helped him do that, and I really attach that importance. But what becomes very critical in the government setups is, how do you institutionalize a particular process so that no matter the change in the commissioner, the change in the government, a movement continues. Now, having said so, when you look at the resource allocation, frankly speaking, city governments in India, resource allocation to education is not very inspirational, so to say. In spite of the fact that when really my predecessor, when he really started sort of modernizing the schools per se in terms of the infrastructure in PCMC, there were a number of examples, in spite of the fact that we keep saying PCMC is so-called one of the richest municipal corporations, that our schools ourselves had few issues in terms of basic infra. We are not even talking about future readiness, by the way, right? We are only talking about a proper toilet, a proper, drinking water system, etc., things like that. And that is where the battle really starts in the government setup. But then we began to build up. We began to think about various other things that can be done. So much so that now there is a good momentum in the system to really, everyone coming together, trying to think that no, we need to allocate resources. We are going over and above the budgeted amounts in the past 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, allocating budget, trying to think of various initiatives, various small things that we can do. Was that the question in terms of resource allocation? I think I've lost my thread a bit.
From your perspective, how do you decide where to prioritize further? Because even in the education space, there is so much focus on different aspects. So do they all bear equal weightage? Do you look at things differently?
They do, and it's also a bit of a learning process. The wheel need not be reinvented every time. A lot of people, a lot of systems, ecosystems have gone through it. As ma'am was mentioning, there are a lot of models which exist right from Tibetan schools to what is happening in Ladakh. Mr. Wangchuk school and other things like that. But having said so, it was also a process for us, for me as well personally in the past 2 years. We started with various things. Eventually we realized that FLN is a huge issue for us. Okay. We are talking about counselors, we are talking about art teachers, we are talking about sports teachers, we are talking about multiple initiatives and multiple things and future readiness as you were talking about. But even the basics are a problem. Right. I don't know if I can and should quote, but Madhukar and the team would testify to that. I think almost about 50 to 60% of our kids have a basic FLN issue, which pushed us into thinking that, okay, everything else has to be probably a little bit in the background. And this entire year now we are devoting to a program called Saksham, where we are doing only thing that we are doing is foundational literacy and numeracy and nothing else. And that we've decided to be the focus. But when you were talking about future readiness earlier, our teachers have to become future ready, and only then can our kids become future ready. And I don't even know whether our teachers currently are future ready. And again, I would emphasize, it's not necessarily got to do with public education system. It's got to do as much with private education system, leaving apart maybe a few top 1, 2, 3, 4% schools and colleges and things like that. And she was very correct. 40% of the kids, Infosys, TCS, they take 6 months to retrain the kids who come out of the engineering colleges. And by the way, that might be true in a lot of economies, not just in India, even in US. I was in US, and the kind of system that I saw in community colleges, I'm not very sure if their community colleges are prepared to send their kids to the industry, even in US. So it's not just an India-specific problem, it's a problem at multiple levels in many countries for that matter. But yes, you are correct. I think the first and foremost thing has to be overall systemic change in the public system, if I talk about leaving apart the private system, to, year on year, institutionalize that whole process. PCMC as an organization is very good. There are other cities where there is more problems. Generally speaking, once you start an initiative in PCMC, there's a greater propensity for it to be carried forward from commissioner to commissioner. And that's how the organization in PCMC is. But I'm not very sure if at other places that can be there. And so that is why I feel from a policy perspective, whether it's from Government of India or government of state governments, it becomes very important to provide that overarching umbrella framework. And that is where you brought in the NEP, which is why NEP and the various facets related to it become so critical. But the whole part is that the NEP is not just Government of India. NEP is government at states, NEP is government in cities. And it's a whole complex mechanism as to how you allocate resources, how you make it compulsory and things like that. I think there can be few tools which can force that. For example, we have a compulsory expenditure of 5% on women and child. All municipal corporations are supposed to do that. I think it's time that we start making that compulsory. Not that it will lead to final results. It might end up being spent on unnecessary infrastructure, but at least it would be a good start from a policy perspective. So even though, individual initiatives, I might be taking, some other commissioners might be taking, some other collectors might be taking, unless and until you don't have overarching umbrella in the state, I think things don't go in a long run of where you intend them to go.
I think that's a great point, because I think creating the institutional framework gives it longer legs, steadier legs to give it longevity. I'll be very candid. I think today when we hear about what's happening in PCMC, most of us associated Shekhar directly with what you are driving, and the fear is, will it continue? So I think there is a personal element, but I think bringing that institutional framework helps carry it forward from that sense. So here I want to just, if you actually look at our panel topic, one is FLN to future readiness, but the second part is the ecosystem ready for it? And I think Shekhar touched upon, it's not just the children and the students, right? What about the teachers? But the ecosystem is far larger. part of it is coming at an institutional framework like NEP, what's coming in. But as a practitioner, what you're seeing in your schools, what you're seeing across, what are the different components of ecosystem as you see it, and your take on what it takes to make them enable our journey for the children?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting thing to think about, because there are two ways that I look at it, right? One is we've been trying to look at, when you look at countries around the world or education systems around the world, some are successful, and that's a minority. If you look at school groups and you look at local systems, again, some are successful. And so many people have tried to study, what is it that they have done well. I was just giving an example where, we started working in the Middle East, in Dubai, around 2005-06, which was 3-4 years after we started. And in those years, we found that the Indian schools in those countries actually used to perform poorer than the average Indian school performance in India. Initially, we were surprised. We thought, oh, that's a rich society. But then we realized that the people who are going here, the expats, are often not educated. They tend to be the manual laborers and so on. And the schools also were large schools, but not particularly focused on the quality of education. And these, by the way, are CBSE and ICSE schools. However, some of these countries took initiatives around 2010, 2012, and where they used to be below the Indian average, they are now much higher than the Indian average. In a period of this change happened over a period of 5 or 6 years. And we can say this because we are independent assessors, exactly the same assessment happening there and here, same board. How did they manage to create a change in 6-7 years that in countries like India and in the US we've been struggling for decades? Now, to take the other example of large countries. Now, one thing that people find is, and this is where I think it's about ecosystems and processes and even thinking. So we find two interesting patterns, right? One is that in every society, there's an attempt to support people who are or children who are from a weaker background. It could be socioeconomically weak, it could be disadvantaged in other ways, it could be migrants in some societies, right? So how do you support them? And there seem to be two formulas, right? One formula is make it easier for them, lower the standards for them. And the second formula is don't lower the standards for them, keep the same standards, but support them to meet the high standards. Most countries, including India and the US, choose to lower standards. So UP will say maths is optional in class 10. The ICSE says maths is optional in class 10. And there are many other things. I mean, as a society, we tend to think that's our way of supporting them. But if I list out 12 or 13 countries that are really good, they don't do this. They say that this standard can be met by everyone. It's our responsibility to support them. And they do this in multiple ways. A variation of the same thing is belief, right? Can every child do it? In a way, these two are connected, right? If I think that this child is very poor, his parents are illiterate, there's no way he'll make it, then I will say I'm going to lower the standards for them. And I find both in government schools and in private schools, you can't get into a conversation within 20 minutes somebody saying this. But these children are from such a background that they cannot do this. And that's it. Somewhere you've lost the game there. And that's not true, right? I mean, there are enough examples to show, and I think in this room we will have personal examples to show that people have achieved when that system and the individual has believed that this, and the individual's thoughts are influenced. So sometimes we say that, parent education, public education campaigns to tell teachers that, look, every child can achieve, here is data that shows it, but you have to believe it, and your actions have to reflect this. So these are softer methods in which the ecosystem has to play a really important role for us to achieve the kind of things that we want to. As long as we think that, okay, we are helping, I as a teacher am doing my best, but what can we do? The parents are illiterate, they don't get the homework done at home, we are not going to achieve this. But these thoughts, these ideas can be changed. I think that has to be a key part of what we are doing.
Thank you.
I think Sridhar really touched upon a very, very, very critical issue. It's about teacher beliefs and teacher capabilities. Over the years, a lot of my research has been to do with teachers. In fact, the last 15 years, I've focused a lot of my work with school teachers. And it is, when you ask teachers, they will give you things like, ये एससी बच्चा है, ये क्या समझेगा, ये लड़की है मैथ्स नहीं समझ पाएगी, वो एसटी वाले लोग को क्या समझ, भाषा ही नहीं समझ में आती. आई एम सॉरी, आई एम स्पीकिंग इन हिंदी. I hope most of you understand some Hindi. The problem is that teacher beliefs has an important role to play in student performance. In fact, this is one of the pieces I've been writing a lot about this. That unless you work on teacher beliefs, because teacher training is not only about subjects. It's not only about subject knowledge. It's also about changing value systems deep within. In fact, one of the very interesting experiences I had with the teachers from Finland was this, where I said, what is your magic? They said, we believe that every child has in her the potential to learn. So if you say that, and if you believe that, then you will be able to reach out to every child. And somehow our teacher training programs don't address caste prejudices, don't address occupational prejudices, saying that ye garib bachcha hai, migrant bachcha hai, those kind of thing. They don't address gender prejudices. So unless you address these prejudices, because it's very deep down, because the social gap between a school teacher and a child going to a municipal school or a government school is huge. And if you have to address that social gap with empathy, then I will just conclude by saying that I also watched the Tibetan schools teacher training program. And one of the main focus, in fact, they got many of the monks to come and actually work with the teachers as to why you need to believe in the capability of every human being. And incidentally, they are CBSE schools funded by MHRD. But the teacher training is different. And you know that 80% of the Tibetan school children go into STEM subjects? Science. Where is it coming from? So I think we have a lot to talk about teacher beliefs. Maybe next time you people do something, I think we need to do a lot more work on how teacher beliefs actually influences student performance at any situation or in any situation. Thank you.
Kurush, I have just one quick point. When we talk about teachers, these are the teachers who are themselves a product mostly of the government public education system. The teachers that I have, if I'm not wrong, I think I took just a straw poll once. Majority of them belong to a Zilla Parishad school somewhere in Maharashtra, where they then took up a job and came here. So they are themselves a product of a system which we are trying to change and which we are trying to sort of make a dent into. And I think we have to be very mindful. Absolutely, can't agree more on both the points that have been said. It's also a personal thing. When we started talking to the teachers, first refrain was what he said. The family is like this. There are n number of issues in the family. Things like that. So pushing them towards that end, because we often forget from where we came from.
True.
And we face the same situation. But now, as she was saying, currently the gap between the kid coming in my school and the teacher is widened. And we forget. And all this, our teachers' kids are going not to the municipal schools, they are going to other schools which are outside the public education system. And then you tend to forget. The only thing that I'm trying to say is that I think I have not been able to crack this code. Jayashri is sitting here, Madhukar and the entire team is sitting here, to crack the code of teacher training. Because, and that to my mind is very, very critical, because see, in our system, we don't have the luxury of selecting who we get. And another issue is that, the aspiration to become a teacher doesn't exist as an aspiration. You have to understand what I'm trying to say. It exists as an option when I don't have some other option. So whether can we get the brightest of the people into that profession is also something from a macro level that, we need to start thinking, and why it has become like that. It wasn't the same, by the way, 50 years back. Teacher as a profession used to be one of those that people really aspired to. But whether that's the same situation for a school teacher currently, I'm not very sure.
Clearly, I've been given the time's up card, Vimla, so I'm going to, but I think clearly we just scratched the surface. You can see this discussion can go on. If I were to try and maybe pick on a few points that I've taken back from these discussions so far. Clearly, what our definition of foundational learning is it static or is it evolving, and does it change its levels basis where the student is a big call out, that it is not a goal seek at a certain level, but at each level your definition of foundational itself has to change and has to vary from there. Working backwards from the goal, the way Stephen Covey called out, what Sridhar shared out, that how are we working backwards from a goal? I think unanimously the whole SEL part, empathy, EQ, sustainability, how is that incorporated as part of the mechanism of education taking it to the schools? A lot of interesting data examples and anecdotal examples or empirical examples, whether coming from Tibetan schools, coming from other schools. And I was fascinated to hear that in 5 to 6 years, the whole equation changed. Normally, when we think of some of these changes, we take a much longer time frame. So this data point is quite fascinating. And I think goes without saying the unanimous view on the criticality of the teachers, what role they need to play. Is the role aspirational? It clearly is not as of now. So that is causing a selection bias. And then secondly, how are you enabling the teachers to take the journey forward, to make it institutional? It cannot be about a one-time injection that you keep putting in once a week, but if you have to make it institutional, how you take it forward. So I do want to thank each of you for your candid views and the audience. Thank you so much. Look forward to more discussions on this topic in the future. Thank you.